So, John, this week, the platform committee of the Democratic Party um, basically did their version of mimicking Joe Biden's campaign in terms of like hanging out in the basement and providing absolutely the bare minimum of an agenda, presumably so that nothing could be criticized on there. And frankly, I think it's a huge missed opportunity. I don't know how big the deal the platform is. I mean, you tell me, but it seems to me like a huge missed opportunity.
I couldn't agree with you more. When the platform committee met, it was very quick. It was almost perfunctory, and clearly the backers of Joe Biden had a majority, which was both his due and his right because of the finish of the primaries and the number of delegates he had. But they were also a very tightly controlled majority, and so the process was incredibly constrained. And when they did approve the platform, then the co-chair of the committee said, "This is the boldest Democratic platform in history," which was absurd. It wasn't the boldest Democratic platform in history. It's not even the boldest Democratic platform, in the modern era. It's as you say, a bare minimum platform. And within a bare minimum platform, because of the progress that's been made over the last many decades on a number of issues, there's some good stuff. There's some excellent stuff in there. For instance, the party is officially against the death penalty. And I know that we would think they would have been a long time ago, but they only put an official anti-death penalty stance in 4 years ago. They're very good on a number of democracy issues, gotten better and better on those. And so that's there, and I all do. There's some decent stuff on addressing the climate crisis. There are some elements in there that are quite good. There's some elements on economic issues that I give them credit for. But what's missing is the high energy, the excitement, the thrill of a platform on which you could fight because it's a uniting set of principles. And I happen to think that platforms do matter. They don't necessarily matter because of the specifics, but it's the frame, it's the idea that you have a political party that is on the march, that has a vision. And they pulled short of the vision on virtually every issue. They're not for legalizing marijuana, which polling shows is an incredibly popular issue and a mobilizing issue for a lot of voters. They're not for changing the qualified immunity for police, which has really become a focal point issue for an awfully lot of activists around the country. They didn't, fully or clearly embrace a Green New Deal, which is something that a rising generation of activists sees as, really vital. They didn't support a federal jobs guarantee, which is, basically to just take you back to the classic New Deal programs, but also things that the Democrats were for into the 70s. They didn't support Medicare for all, which I think at this point is well understood as a touchstone issue, not just for progressives, but for tens of millions of Americans who've come to recognize in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic and mass unemployment that our current healthcare system doesn't work. So I just think missed opportunity after missed opportunity.
Well, let's before we get into those specifics, give me a sense of how you see. I mean, I get the idea that it creates a certain enthusiasm, and I don't know. I guess, do you think it's so hard to say these things, but it's a decent way to try and tease out what's going on here.
Mm-hmm.
Let's imagine a world where Joe Biden is the nominee, but there is no COVID. That Joe Biden, look, I guess, with the assumption that Joe Biden would be campaigning differently if there was no COVID. Joe Biden, not the most energetic campaigner during the primary. Obviously, it was effective, or at least to the extent that, it needed to be. He has been able to basically stay in his basement, more or less. And the whole strategy has been, let's more or less make it like Donald Trump is running for like it's just running on a vote of confidence. And so if COVID wasn't there, I mean, I think that, the things were trending pretty poorly for Donald Trump anyways. But if COVID wasn't there, do you think that there would be more pressure for the platform as almost like a surrogate for pressuring Joe Biden to lean in more, to do something more proactive, like you say, that would spark some type of energy?
I think there would be much more pressure, and I think we'd be much more conscious of it. For one thing, events would be taking place physically rather than through Zoom and crowdcast or whatever vehicle we're using for the week that we're talking about. And that would be a huge deal because physical presence matters, especially as regards the development of a platform. I've covered platform hearings over the years, and I've covered them for both parties. And this is why I think platforms really do matter. It is in the platform process that parties wrestle with their future and wrestle with, kind of what their vision is and how they're going to, build themselves out, effectively what they're going to be. I watched the Republican Party over I've been at this for a while, my friend. So I watched them in the 80s and the 90s and into the 2010s as you saw them move progressively to the right and become, even more corporate, even more rigid on the social issues. And that defined the modern Republican Party. There's simply no doubt of it. And you saw it in the platform process. And that's part of what built the loyalty and the enthusiasm of religious conservatives, religious right, if you will, to the Republican Party. Because even if they didn't like a particular candidate, they believed that platform was a defining document and that actually the fact that they could win fights there showed them where they would ultimately end up. And in fact, they were right. So this is why I think platform processes matter. And I think that this year, because of two vital realities, number one, we've seen the rise of mass movements that are better at communicating the urgency of the moment. And remember, if COVID didn't exist, we would still have the urgency of massive income inequality. We would still have the urgency of systemic racism and police violence. We would still have the urgency of a climate crisis. And we'd still have the urgency of Donald Trump's, awful presidency. And so I do think that for that reason, you'd have, a force there, an energy there, a focus there. And then secondly is more of a strategic reality that we've come into a period in our country where we are so deeply divided, whether folks like it or not. And both parties no longer rely so much as winning the middle, although this year it may be more possible to win the middle, but they rely less on winning the middle than on mobilizing their base. And the Republicans figured that out a long time ago. They go to maximum mobilization of their base. Democrats have historically been very cautious about that. I write about it a lot in my new book. And I think this would have been the year in which those who said, no, it's time to mobilize the base, it's time to build the base, might have prevailed.
I want to get to that last point. I just want to just note one thing. I remember back in the in the aughts, looking at the Texas Republican platform and going, man, this thing is insane. And and then 15 years later, it's that's basically it. I mean, of course, they didn't say we don't believe in masks or something because they didn't know. But my point being that one wonders if it is just sort of an indication of what's brewing within a party, or if it is a something in which that pushes the party, right? Like, I mean, are we going to look back on this in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? And I would imagine we're probably it's going to look different in those different times. But are we going to look back on this and say, you know what? That may have been the platform, but that's not where the party was as evidenced by the passage of X, Y, or Z, 2 years ago, 5 years. Do you know what I'm saying?
I do. And I think, look, here's what I would say to you. The platform fights, in many ways, are a better early warning signal of where a political party is going than the nominations of candidates. Because the nominations of candidates are often driven by personality, by money, a host of other things. It's in the platform fights that you really start to get your sort of early signals. And so the great platform fights in the Democratic Party in the 40s and 50s over civil rights, and they had brutal battles, going back to as far back as 1944. Those gave us a sense of where we're headed on civil rights, right? And similarly, in the Republican Party, the platform fights of the 70s on abortion rights, equal rights amendment, a host of other issues, really gave you the best signal that that party was moving hard to the right on social issues. And so they give you an indication of where the future is going. And what the Democratic Party platform this year tells me is that, the sort of status quo centrist forces which have dominated the party for a very long time, at least at the functional level, at the organizational level, continue to hold sway. That's like it or not, that is the reality. You can blame Joe Biden for that, but I think that's wrongheaded. I think the reality is that there is a centrist, corporate-friendly force, within the Democratic Party that continues to be incredibly powerful. It's way under recognized, and they exercise their power, particularly at the platform process as they did this year, because there were so many areas where polling shows you that people are desperate for change. People desperately want Medicare for all. People desperately want, a new approach to jobs and the economy. People desperately want, action on climate. They will desperately want action on racial inequality, racial injustice. I mean, the polling tells us this, right? And yet the party, too frequently on too many issues pulls its punch. And you ask, well, why do they do that? It's just practical politics would tell you to be bolder. And yet there's still this, this caution, this refusal to go big. And I think it's based in two realities. Number one is corporate power, corporate influence, which exists in both parties. But also, number two, there are sincere people, good people even, who, just don't believe that you could run a progressive campaign, that you could really go big, go bold, and prevail. And I would just simply say I think they're wrong. I think they're genuinely wrong. And they may make it through this year. Biden may well win. Democrats may well do pretty well because of the horrors of Trump and frankly, the events of the moment. But a failure to go bold almost always comes back to haunt the party. And I think it will, if not this year, in 2 years or 4 years.
Right. Tom Cotton, 2024.
Yeah.
Please,
Scary
if there's
thought.
anybody out there who's listening to that who has the ability to stop that from happening,
Well, Nikki Haley, I'm sure, is Nikki Haley.
Exactly.
Listening and taking notes.
Nevertheless, I don't think she would be much better. But all that said, the frustrating thing about it is this seems to when is it right? I mean, I guess there is it's not like the party is making apologies. It's not like the establishment is in any way that Nancy Pelosi, that Joe Biden are making apologies to anybody. There you do hear an occasional, like, we can't afford to do it this year, right? Like, there's two things that are going on here. On one hand, there are real material interests of corporate benefactors who do not want Medicare for all. Like Pelosi and her chief of staff in particular, but also, the establishment players, they all get a ton of money from the healthcare industry. They don't want Medicare for all. And that's one reason why they do it. The other reason you hear is, like, we don't want to give Donald Trump something to run against. But it seems to me that, if not now, when? I know the answer to that. And that's when really, a generation or two, heads into deep retirement. But
Yeah.
but
even
but
there, they train the
contextually,
next generation. Yeah.
right? I
No,
mean,
I agree.
contextually though, I mean, like, has there ever been a better opportunity for radical? And I just don't think it's that radical. I mean, like, they could have done buy-in to Medicare at 55, right? Like, I mean,
yeah, which
there
they
was,
refused, by the way.
yeah, that's my point, is that there was absolutely no give whatsoever here. Nothing.
Mm-mm. No, in fact, the votes on these issues on the platform committee were stark and
who are these people who are
unsettling.
on the committee? I mean, they're more or less lobbyists, aren't they?
No, there's a mix. In fairness, I've watched the committee pretty closely, and so you've got party insiders. You have it's by and large people who have been very active in the party for a very long time. Now, some of them may be lobbyists. I acknowledge that, but there's also a lot of people who are simply sort of in the mindset that it's dangerous to do something big, right? It's just like they're so used to caution and so used to compromise. And remember, the platform committee is made up of people from a lot of different states, right? So you have folks there, some folks who actually are more conservative. You have some folks who are more left-wing. But there's just a tremendous number of people who kind of buy into the party establishment, buy into the party structures as they exist. And that's no different. I mean, that exists in political parties in this country and other places. It's not a shocking thing. But what I would suggest to you is on the other side of your question there, and where you really got into something important, is then can this ever happen? When would it ever happen? Is there ever a better time than this? Well, here's the reality. When I was doing the book, I went back and I looked at these platform fights. I looked at political fights in the Democratic Party going back to the 1940s, and the reality is that if you look at what the Democratic Party compromised on in like 1944 or 1976, things like that, where they compromised is shocking, right? Then you say, well, how could they possibly have taken that stand? Because history is not kind to those who compromise on fundamental moral issues, on fundamental justice issues. And I think that history is not going to be particularly kind to this moment. And unfortunately, that's the pattern that the party is in. And so what I would argue is progressives have to recognize that, and they have to be willing to fight harder. Now, I know that I'm not suggesting that people aren't fighting hard. I think they are. But they have to be willing to fight hard and consistently year after year, and to not kind of pull back and say, oh, this is the wrong year to do it, or it won't work in this year. Because those compromises actually come back to haunt the party. It may win one election, it may win a presidential, and then lose its governing majority in the off-year election 2 years later. And also, they haunt the country. The Democratic Party should have come down strong for racial justice in 1944. And we should have started talking much more deeply about climate issues in the 70s and 80s, or at least about what would come to be defined as climate issues. Avoiding these issues at the time that they arise and it's necessary makes the Democratic Party just another political party, right? They're competing for power, and you don't want to be that. You want to be something that young people look at and say, boy, I want to be a part of that. I know we may not win this year, but boy, I want to be a part of that. That's what I'm committing to, because I believe, we're about a set of principles and ideals, and that's what a platform ought to be.
Well, I mean, just since we're here, and I imagine you and I are going to have this conversation, a similar one, maybe in 2 or 3 months, about this. But I would like to touch on it now, just to get a sense of where we're at, because this platform, like you say, is indicative of what the dynamic is in the Democratic Party between progressives and really, I mean, I think some of these things, sorry, I don't even think it's, I mean, is it really a progressive issue to legalize marijuana at this point? I mean,
No, the polling
I mean,
shows
it's
across
absurd.
the
Half
board.
the states it's already legal. I mean, it's just absurd. It's like I don't know. I mean, it just seems to be it's a progressive issue if we travel back in time 10 years. Like, it's here. It's already happening. I mean, to come out against legalization of marijuana just seems like, I don't know, like, calling for Leave It to Beaver to be run on TV again. I mean, it just seems absurd. Um, but but with this dynamic, are you aware, or what is your opinion? Because I know you remember where we were this time with Obama. Obama at this point had basically said, his campaign had said to donors and to everybody else, no donating to outside groups. All donations come to us. They basically wanted to starve the outside groups. Within months after, or within a month after the election, the Obama for America, sort of infrastructure was more or less completely degraded and diffused because they did not want any challenges, and everybody sort of went to sleep for a year, thinking like, okay, Republicans are done, and Barack Obama will get to it. And then, people started to realize, okay, wait a second. I think it was the bankruptcy cram down was the first thing that people were like, wait a second. But my point is that Joe Biden's not going to have that honeymoon, and nobody's under any illusions as to Joe Biden's progressivism. I mean, and it may be helping him in his election insofar as that Donald Trump has no toehold, right? He's like saying like Joe Biden is for is for the protesters, and everybody's just like, we wish.
They laugh.
Right, right. It's laughable.
Right?
I mean, it's just laughable.
Yeah.
And but are you aware of groups that are beginning to strategize, coming up with some type of list of priorities? Like, what is the agenda of the left, the legislative left, to the extent that there is one? I don't even know what that I'm not sure I even know what that means. But what is the agenda of the left in terms of like prioritizing things, strategizing? Are you aware of any of that going on now?
Yes, it is. And the groups like the Sunrise Movement and a lot of these relatively new groups that have come into play are showing both political sophistication and I think an understanding of an inside-outside strategy. These tend to be groups often led by very young people, and that's vital to this because young people have a sense of urgency and a willingness to break some rules in order to get to the places that we need to get to. And so my sense is that you do see some rising groups. You also see some people coming into Congress who are much bolder on the issues and much more outspoken. We've always had a Barbara Lee and a handful of other people, but Barbara Lee has a lot of allies now. And I'll give you a good example. We had a budget fight on Pentagon budget, and there was a proposal to cut the Pentagon budget by 10% and move that money to human needs here at home. And that proposal got the votes of about 120 members of Congress, mostly members of the House, but also a substantial vote in the Senate. Why that matters is, and of course it lost, right? But why it matters is, I was talking to Barbara Lee about it just the other day. That never happened before. You know what I mean? At least in the modern era, this is epic what's going on as regards kind of the movement on some of these issues. These fights are going to be very, very hard. But we have to ask ourselves, why did they get so many votes? Why did you get, such a substantial number of people to vote for a 10% cut in the Pentagon budget? I'd give you the answer right now. We are looking at the most jarring times in our lives. Unless you're very old and lived through the Great Depression of World War II, we are literally looking at a circumstance where the next president of the United States is going to have to deal with a lingering public health crisis that probably will not be under control even when that president comes into office. We are looking at mass unemployment. We are looking at a collapse of small business and small farming in this country. We have a racial justice demand that is urgent and real and cannot be neglected. We have a climate crisis demand that is urgent and real and cannot be neglected. I mean, you start to look at everything that this next president is going to have to deal with. And I can tell you right off the bat, tinkering around the edges, half steps will guarantee a Republican victory in the midterm elections of 2022 and potentially a Republican victory in 2024 for the presidency. Less of a guarantee on the presidential than on the midterms. And that ought to have people terrified. And so I think there are people at the legislative left, if you will, and the mobilizing left, if you will, who recognize that they can't go soft. They cannot expect that, you know, just beating Trump is going to solve all these problems. It's not. This is a time for great, big, incredibly bold action. And incredibly bold action, like the bigger you go, the harder you hit that ball, the more likely it is that you maintain your governing majority. Big action, bold action doesn't undermine a Democratic president. It strengthens that president because then people feel like they're invested in something that's real. Just ask Franklin Roosevelt, right?
Yep.
I mean, that's just the simple reality. Roosevelt didn't succeed on everything he did. And Roosevelt had a tremendous number of critics, including folks on the left, and sometimes rightly so. And yet he went big. He went, you know, on big on a whole bunch of stuff. And the reward of that was victory in the midterm elections of 1934, a bigger victory in 1936, a tough election in 38, but still a victory, a big re-election in 1940, a good 1942 election cycle, and a big victory in 1944. I mean, that's a pretty good cycle there. And the argument of saying going big, going bold seems to pay off.
John Nichols from The Nation magazine, as always, a real pleasure. The fight continues.
It's a pleasure to be with you, my friend. Always great to talk to you.